She thought it was just a lynx, until she discovered its shocking secret. The cold wind howled through the towering pine trees, rattling the wooden shutters of Eleanor Reed's cabin. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, a familiar scent she had come to love in the years she had spent in isolation. Her small cabin, perched on the edge of Clearwater Lake, was the only home she had known since she walked away from her old life. Eleanor had once been a celebrated wildlife photographer, traveling the world to capture the untamed beauty of nature. But after losing her only son, Nathan, in a tragic accident, she had abandoned everything: her career, her friends, and the bustling city life. She had found solace in the wilderness, choosing to live among the creatures she once only photographed. Now her days were spent in silence, waking before dawn to take pictures of the world before it stirred. She had no one to talk to except for the occasional wolf she spotted near the tree line, or the lonely calls of an owl at night. It was a life without complications, without attachments. At least, that was what she told herself. But on this particular evening, something changed. A sudden sound outside broke Eleanor's thoughts. A soft rustling near the porch, barely audible over the wind. She tensed, reaching for the rifle she kept by the door. Living in the wilderness had taught her to always be prepared. Bears, mountain lions, and other predators roamed these lands. But this sound was different, lighter, hesitant. Slowly, she stood and moved toward the window. Through the dim light of dusk, she saw a shadowy figure crouched near the edge of her porch. At first, she thought it was a fox, small with pointed ears. But as the shape moved, stepping closer into the glow of the cabin's lantern, she realized it was something else. A lynx. Eleanor's breath caught. She had seen lynxes before, but only from a distance. These elusive wildcats were masters of hiding, blending into the dense forests. Yet here one was, standing just feet away, its yellow eyes locked onto hers through the window. But something was wrong. The lynx's fur was matted and dirty, its ribs visible beneath the thick coat. It was injured, limping slightly as it shifted its weight from one paw to another. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated. This was not her problem. The wild took care of its own. Survival was a brutal game, and only the strongest made it. But then the lynx let out a soft, almost pleading sound, a low, breathy chirp, unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard before. And just like that, something inside her shifted. Eleanor knew she couldn't simply let the lynx suffer. Against her better judgment, she grabbed an old blanket and stepped onto the porch. The lynx tensed but did not run. Its ears flicked, watching her every move. "Easy," Eleanor murmured, keeping her voice soft. She crouched, extending the blanket just a little. The lynx's nostrils flared, testing the air. Then, to Eleanor's shock, it took a tentative step forward. She remained still, barely breathing. The lynx crept closer, wary but desperate. When it finally reached the edge of the blanket, Eleanor saw the full extent of its injury. A deep gash on its hind leg, dried blood crusted over the fur. She knew what she had to do. Slowly, carefully, she reached for the bowl of water she had left on the porch earlier that day. She placed it just a foot away from the lynx and stepped back. The lynx hesitated, then dipped its head, lapping at the water with quick, cautious strokes. Eleanor watched in silence, her heart pounding. It had been years since she had felt needed by anything or anyone. But now, under the soft glow of her cabin's lantern, she realized this wild creature was putting its trust in her. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor wasn't sure she wanted to be alone anymore. The lynx, whom Eleanor soon named Nova, returned the next evening. And the next. At first, she remained cautious, keeping her distance even as Eleanor left food and water outside. But with each passing day, the space between them grew smaller. Then one morning, Eleanor woke to something unexpected: tiny paw prints in the snow. She stepped onto the porch, her breath turning to mist in the cold air. The prints were smaller than Nova's, leading away from where she had left food the night before. A chill ran down her spine, not from the cold, but from realization. Nova wasn't alone. For the first time, Eleanor understood why the lynx had risked approaching her cabin, why she had allowed herself to accept food from a human. She had a cub, a fragile, helpless cub, hidden somewhere in the wilderness. And Eleanor knew Nova had not just come to her for survival, She had come for help, and soon that cub would need her too.
The discovery of the tiny paw prints changed everything. Eleanor stood on her porch, staring at the delicate indentations in the snow. They were much smaller than Nova's, barely half the size. Her breath curled in the cold morning air as she followed the trail with her eyes, watching how they weaved in and out of the tree line before vanishing into the deeper forest. Nova had a cub. The thought sent a rush of emotions through her, excitement, concern, and something else she couldn't quite name. For weeks, Nova had been cautiously accepting food, growing stronger, but she had never revealed this secret. Had the cub been watching from a distance all along? Eleanor knew what this meant. Nova wasn't just surviving for herself, she had been fighting for her baby all along. For the next few days, Eleanor observed Nova more closely. The Lynx still came at dusk, her piercing yellow eyes glowing in the fading light. But now Eleanor noticed something different. Nova no longer ate everything Eleanor left out. Some nights she took only a few bites before disappearing into the woods, carrying the remaining food carefully in her jaws. She wasn't just feeding herself, she was bringing food to her cub. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. She had assumed Nova was merely a survivor, just another animal seeking shelter from the harsh winter. But the truth was far more profound. Nova was a mother, making sacrifices to protect her baby. And out in the wild, a mother's love was the most powerful force of all. Eleanor felt an unexpected pull in her chest. She knew that kind of love. Years ago, she had been a mother too. She had held her son's tiny hands, soothed his cries, watched him take his first steps. She had protected him as fiercely as Nova now protected her cub. But love hadn't been enough to save Nathan. Eleanor clenched her jaw, forcing the memory back. She wasn't ready to face that pain. Not yet. Instead, she focused on Nova. She had to find the cub. The next evening, Eleanor did something she hadn't done in years. She stepped beyond her cabin's safety and followed Nova. Dressed in layers, she grabbed her camera, binoculars, and a small flashlight. She had spent years tracking animals from a distance, learning their movements. If Nova had a cub hidden somewhere, Eleanor wanted to know where. She kept a safe distance, her boots crunching softly over the snow. Nova moved with practiced grace, weaving between trees, stopping every few minutes to listen. Eleanor held her breath each time, her heartbeat matching the rhythm of the forest. Then, after nearly an hour, Nova finally reached her destination. A small den nestled beneath the thick roots of a fallen pine tree. Eleanor crouched behind a nearby bush, her breath shallow. A tiny movement inside the den, then another. And then she saw it. A small lynx cub, barely the size of a house cat, with soft grey fur and wide, curious eyes. The little creature stepped out of the den on shaky legs, sniffing the cold air. Its ears twitched, sensing Nova's return, and with an excited chirp it rushed forward, nuzzling into its mother's chest. Eleanor swallowed hard, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through her. She had spent years photographing wildlife, witnessing the raw, untamed beauty of nature, but she had never seen anything quite like this. A mother reunited with her child, a bond so strong it defied hunger, fear, and even death itself. Nova bent her head, grooming her cub with slow, careful licks. She was thin, too thin, but her cub was healthy, full of life. Somehow, against all odds, she had kept her baby alive. But Eleanor knew the truth. Winter was far from over, and in the wild, not all mothers won their battles. Over the next week, Eleanor kept her distance but continued watching. She left food further from her cabin, closer to Nova's den, so the lynx wouldn't have to travel as far. Nova remained cautious, always checking the area before bringing her cub out. Eleanor began noticing signs of other predators. Large paw prints appeared in the snow near her property. Not lynx, not wolf. Something bigger. Then came the growling at night, low and distant but unmistakable. A bear. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Bears weren't supposed to be active in winter, but some, especially younger males, emerged from hibernation early if they were desperate for food. And a starving bear roaming through the forest was one of the most dangerous creatures imaginable. Nova had no chance against a bear, and neither did her cub. The following night, Eleanor sat on her porch, scanning the darkness with her flashlight. The eerie stillness of the forest sent a shiver down her spine. Then she heard it. A low, guttural growl, Eleanor froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. The sound came from beyond the trees, deep and menacing, and she wasn't the only one who heard it. From the shadows, Nova let out a sharp, urgent cry. Eleanor's heart clenched. She had never heard Nova make a sound like that before. It wasn't a hunting call. It wasn't even a warning for Eleanor. It was a mother's desperate signal to her cub, a warning that death was near. Nova's cub chirped in confusion, stepping toward her, but the mother blocked the entrance of the den with her body, eyes locked onto the darkness. Eleanor reached for her rifle, gripping it with trembling hands. Then, just beyond the trees, a dark shape moved. A massive, hulking shadow, barely visible in the dim light. The bear. It was closer than she had feared. And it was watching. The wind carried the sharp scent of pine and damp earth as Eleanor stared into the darkness beyond the trees. Her fingers tightened around the rifle resting on her lap, though she knew a single bullet wouldn't be enough to stop a full-grown bear. The shadow moved again. Eleanor's breath caught as the massive creature stepped into the faint moonlight filtering through the treetops. A young male grizzly, its thick fur matted with remnants of the harsh winter. Its dark eyes flicked toward the cabin, but it wasn't Eleanor it was after. It had caught Nova's scent. The bear let out a deep, rattling growl, lifting its nose to the wind, sniffing. Eleanor turned her gaze to Nova's den, barely visible in the undergrowth. The mother lynx was a mere silhouette, her body shielding her cub as the little one pressed into her fur. Eleanor had seen this before in the wild, predators circling their prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. But this wasn't just a hunt, this was survival. Nova had fought so hard to keep her cub alive, and now, in a matter of minutes, it could all be over. Eleanor refused to let that happen. The bear took a step forward, its huge paws pressing deep into the snow. Eleanor's mind raced. If she fired a shot, she might scare it off, but it could also provoke it. Bears didn't back down easily, especially when hungry. Nova let out a piercing yowl, her ears flattened against her head, her tail puffed up in warning. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was standing her ground. Eleanor's gut twisted. She had seen what happened to mothers who stood their ground. She had learned it the hard way. Not again. Without thinking, Eleanor grabbed the flashlight beside her and switched it on. A powerful beam of white light cut through the night, illuminating the bear's massive frame. The sudden brightness startled it, making it hesitate for a brief moment. But only a moment. Then, with a deep rumbling snarl, the bear lunged forward. The world seemed to slow as Nova exploded into action. Instead of fleeing, she charged. Eleanor's breath caught as the lynx sprang toward the bear, not in attack, but in tactical defiance. Nova was fast, faster than Eleanor had ever seen a lynx move. She darted between the bear's massive legs, weaving like a phantom, slashing at the air just close enough to confuse the beast. The bear roared in frustration, its head whipping from side to side, trying to track her movement. It couldn't. Nova was too small, too fast, too clever. She wasn't trying to fight the bear. She was leading it away from her cub, away from the den. Eleanor's hands shook as she fumbled inside the cabin, searching for something, anything to help. Then she remembered, the flare gun. Eleanor's fingers closed around the cold metal handle. She bolted back outside, raising the flare gun with trembling hands, her eyes darting between Nova and the bear. Nova zigzagged through the snow, forcing the bear to chase her, keeping just out of reach. But Eleanor could see it. The bear was learning. It was adjusting. And Nova was tiring. She had one shot. She aimed and fired. A deafening crack split the air as the flare shot upward, exploding into a burst of searing red light. The bear froze, rearing up on its hind legs, momentarily blinded by the sudden blaze. Nova took her chance. She dashed toward Eleanor, her paws kicking up snow, her wild eyes locking onto the porch, to safety. The bear shook its head, still dazed, then let out an earth-shaking roar. But something in the flare's unnatural brightness spooked it. With one final huff, the bear turned and lumbered back into the darkness. Silence. Eleanor's chest heaved, her pulse pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. Then from the shadows, Nova emerged. Her sides heaved with exhaustion, her fur damp with sweat, but she was alive. and behind her, trembling but unharmed, the cub appeared. Eleanor fell to her knees, gasping for air. Nova stared at her, unblinking. And then, in an action that made Eleanor's heart nearly stop, Nova took a slow, cautious step forward, and then another, until she stood just inches away. For the first time since they met, Nova let Eleanor reach out. With a shaking hand, Eleanor pressed her fingers gently against the lynx's fur. Soft, warm, alive. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. She had spent years believing that protecting something meant keeping your distance, that love could only bring pain. But Nova had taught her something different. Love wasn't about avoiding loss. It was about fighting for what mattered, no matter the cost. Eleanor would not turn away anymore. She would fight too. Spring arrived, melting the thick blanket of snow that had once covered Eleanor's world. And for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. Nova and her cub, whom Eleanor named Ash, remained close. Though they still roamed the forest, they returned to the cabin often, always greeted by Eleanor's watchful eyes and open heart. The camera that had once been Eleanor's only companion now captured something far more precious. A mother lynx teaching her cub to survive, just as she had taught Eleanor to live again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Eleanor sat on her porch, watching as Nova stood at the edge of the trees. Their eyes met. A silent understanding passed between them. And as Nova turned, leading her cub back into the wild, Eleanor whispered, "Thank you," for saving her, for reminding her what it meant to love, for proving that even in the heart of the wild, a mother's courage knew no bounds.